Hello everyone, welcome to Psychopathology 1. I have re-recorded this lecture because the first time I tried to record the lecture, about halfway through the slides stopped skipping forwards. So if you guys are joining me now, then welcome. If you guys tried to watch the initial video, I'm sorry. Hopefully this one will be a little more easy to follow. So today we're going to be doing Psychopathology 1. Over the next two sessions, so today and Wednesday, we're going to be covering the top 4 paradigms, so psychodynamic, biological, behavioural and cognitive. We're going to be discussing common treatments, and we're also going to be engaging in some contemporary discussion via the Moodle forums. So today, we are going to be looking at what is psychopathology and how do we define it. We are going to be looking at 2 paradigms in psychopathology, so the psychodynamic paradigm and the biological paradigm, and then we're going to be watching a TED Talk and engaging in a class discussion. So, what is psychopathology? I'll just move that to this corner here. So what is psychopathology? Psychopathology is defined as the study of psychiatric disorders, so the study of mental health conditions such as depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, etc. It was at this point in the lecture that I was hoping to ask you guys to engage in a mini group discussion, thinking about how we define abnormal behaviour and at what point does abnormal behaviour become pathological. Unfortunately, as we are not in class today, we are not going to be able to engage in these discussions. However, if you would like to still do that, you can pause the recording now and you can spend a few minutes just considering what you think is abnormal behaviour and at what point does abnormal behaviour become pathological. What is abnormal and what is pathological can be very difficult to define. Sometimes people are abnormal, but they are completely mentally healthy, and sometimes people can appear completely typical, but actually be engaging in pathological behaviours. So it's very difficult to identify what is pathological from what is just different. There are some ways, however, that we can try and identify what is abnormality, what is pathologically abnormal. One of those definitions of abnormality is statistical infrequency. Under this definition of abnormality, we assume that a behaviour is abnormal if it occurs infrequently in the population. So as we can see here, we have a normal distribution curve. Now we can see that some people would fall, in this case we're looking at IQ, so some people will fall at lower ends of IQ, and some people will fall at the higher ends of IQ. But typically we have the people that fall in the middle as being the statistically frequent levels of IQ, somewhere between 80 and 120, with 100s being average. Now, this example is an example of where abnormality does not equal psychopathology. This is because having a lower level of intelligence does not equal having a mental illness, the same as having a high level of intelligence does not equal having a mental illness. However, if we consider different types of behavioural abnormality, say someone attends lecture regularly wearing just a bathrobe and slippers, you might consider this to be quite abnormal. So their behaviour is very abnormal. They're not doing what everyone else is doing and wearing typical lecture clothes. Now, this might suggest that there is a pathology there. They might be experiencing depression or hallucinations or not be engaging in socially acceptable behaviour, or they might be completely psychologically fine, but instead just be slightly kooky and enjoy behaving abnormally. We would not necessarily consider that to be psychopathology. So let's look at a different definition of abnormality. Now, this definition is deviation from social norms. So this is when behaviour is considered abnormal if it violates the often unwritten rules that we abide by in society. So if we go back to the previous example of someone coming to lecture wearing a bathrobe and slippers, this might be considered a deviation from, or this would be considered a deviation from social norms and could be defined as an abnormality. Again, we are unsure if that means they have a psychopathology, but because they are deviating from the unwritten rules of society, this will be considered to be abnormal. However, cultural norms are highly culture bound. Social norms are highly culture bound. If you had a friend who, for 3 hours during the day, refused to engage in any social interaction, did not work, went home, cooked themselves a large meal and slept every day between the hours of 2 and 5, you might consider that to be very abnormal. You might even consider that to be a symptom of depression if they were sleeping for a long time during the day, as social withdrawal and hypersomnia are symptoms of depression, so that might be concerning. However, in a lot of Mediterranean countries, taking a siesta during the day is considered very typical and actually an appropriate and approved of social behaviour. So in Spain, siesta times are between 2 and 5. At this time, the shops close and the vast majority of people go home or somewhere else they can rest. Now, this is to avoid the midday heat, to limit their working hours during the day, to be able to enjoy a long and healthy lunch, to be able to carry on their energy into the evening, to be able to enjoy the late night lifestyle, and to be able to have a healthy afternoon nap, so to be able to have a rest during that time. Again, if we saw that kind of behaviour in England, or in Wales or Scotland, Ireland, we might find this behaviour to be very strange, because this is one of our social norms. However, in Mediterranean countries, this would be considered quite typical. Our next definition of abnormality is failure to function adequately. Now, this is one that you might find the most easy to assess if someone has a pathological issue. So, this is an assessment of whether or not the individual is able to engage with basic aspects of life to ensure well-being. For example, are they able to get out of bed? Are they able to maintain relationships? Are they able to go to work and maintain a job? Things that are associated with their well-being, if they are not able to do those, they are possibly considered not able to function adequately. Now, that would be lost my train of thought. That would be an indicator of behavioural abnormality and might even be a symptom of a psychological issue such as depression. Finally, we have deviation from ideal mental health. Now, as psychologists, as health professionals, we would hope that people would assume that mental health is similar to physical health. Much with physical health, abnormality should therefore be defined by what is considered deviating from what is healthy. Jehoda suggested 6 criteria necessary for ideal mental health. An absence of any of these characteristics indicate the individual as being abnormal. In other words, they are displaying a deviation from ideal mental health. These include having a positive view of yourself, having a capability for growth and development. So is that person able to work towards goals? Is that person able to engage in day-to-day life and set themselves tasks and look after themselves? Do they have autonomy and independence? Are they pathologically dependent on someone else? Do they have an accurate perception of reality? Are they experiencing auditory or visual hallucinations or paranoia? Do they have positive friendships and relationships? So are they able to interact with other people in their daily lives without fear? And do they have environmental mastery? Are they able to meet the varying demands of day-to-day situations? This final point, this final criteria, is very heavily associated with the previous definition of abnormality, which was failure to function adequately. So, environmental mastery is the person still able to function in their day-to-day life. According to this approach, the more criteria are satisfied, the healthier the individual is. However, a lack or failure of each of these characteristics and abilities implies abnormality and/or a pathological disorder. So, you will find on the Moodle page a forum where you can submit your responses to this question. Please discuss and identify the strengths and weaknesses of each definition of abnormality. Feedback for this will be given via a vlog on Thursday afternoon. You needn't necessarily spend a lot of time on this. In the session, I would have asked you guys to spend 20 minutes on this task in groups, so please spend approximately that length of time on this task now. After this task, we will take a 10-minute break before we move on to Paradigms in Psychopathology Part 1. Okay, now that you've spent some time engaging with the forum and having a 10-minute break, we're going to start on Paradigms in Psychopathology Part 1, the first being the psychodynamic paradigm. Now, the psychodynamic approach is based on Freud's writings between the 1890s and the 1930s. These writings make up the assumptions of the psychodynamic approach. The first is that our behaviour and internal experiences are influenced by our unconscious. The second is that personality is made of three parts: the id, the ego, and the superego. And the third is that adult behaviour and internal experiences are rooted in childhood experiences. Over the next few slides, we'll explore each of these three assumptions and how this might lead to pathological adult behaviour. So, the first being that our behaviour and internal experiences are influenced by our unconscious. According to Freud, the unconscious mind is the core of our thoughts, feelings, and behaviour. He considered our mind to be like an iceberg, with our conscious minds being above the water, what can be seen, what can be felt, and our unconscious minds being below the water. So if we consider the entire iceberg to be our personality and behaviour, we are only aware of a small section that is on top of the water. Everything else, our childhood experiences, our internal thoughts, feelings and desires, will lie below the water in our unconscious mind. Our feelings, motives and decisions are actually powerfully influenced by our past experiences, and they are stored in our unconscious. Therefore, pathological behaviour is likely the result of something that the individual has no control of. They experience thoughts, feelings and behaviours that are motivated by things that are not in their conscious mind, so therefore they struggle to understand how to deal with this because they don't know what is causing them to engage with this behaviour or feel their thoughts and feelings. Next is that the personality is made of three parts: the id, the ego and the superego. This is the tripartite model of personality. The id is the pleasure principle. Now this is present at birth. The id requires immediate gratification, and this kind of explains how babies, when they are born, they don't understand that they need to wait to be gratified. Of course they don't, they're babies, they don't understand the world yet, and this is why they are only motivated by their internal desires of being fed, going to the toilet, being given attention, and they require immediate gratification for that. They don't understand that the world doesn't revolve around them, and therefore everything needs to happen right now, immediately. And then we have the ego. Now, this is the reality principle. This develops around the ages of 1 to 2 years old, as the infant understands that the world around them does not actually revolve around them, but is influenced by other things. At the age of 1 to 2, children can sort of understand the concept of waiting. Not for a long time. They will not have the patience or the ability to wait for a long time, but they don't scream the second they want something, where a newborn baby would likely cry immediately if they felt any kind of discomfort. Now, the ego is more conscious of the demands of the real world and actually makes decisions about behaviour. So the ego sits in the conscious mind, or it largely sits in the conscious mind. Finally, we have the superego. Now, the superego is the morality principle, and this develops when the child progresses through the phallic stage of psychosexual development. Now, there will be more on that on the next slide. This occurs around the age of 6. So, the superego is where their morals are stored, and the superego is hyperconscious about the needs of others, about the demands of the real world as well, and incorporates morals into behaviour. So we have the devil on our shoulder that desperately wants us to do everything to gratify ourselves immediately, and that is the id. We have the superego, which is the angel on our other shoulder, which wants us to satisfy everyone else and make sure that all of the things are taken care of before ourselves. And then we have the ego, the reality principle. Now, this balances the two to ensure that you are successfully both gratified and not engaging in inappropriate behaviours in the real world. However, the ego sometimes comes under stress because it's attempting to balance the id and the superego's demands. And this is where we might see pathological behaviour. This is because the ego might feel overwhelmed and engage in something called ego defense mechanisms. So the ego will protect itself by using these mechanisms. For example, if they are finding the demands of the id and the superego too stressful, they might engage in a defense mechanism called projection. Now, this is where the individual, so the person with their id, ego, and superego, will project their negative feelings about themselves onto someone else. So they might be feeling terribly upset because they're feeling lazy and stressed, and so rather than being able to accept that, they project that feeling onto someone else. So they would see that other person as being lazy. Now, this is projection and is an ego defense mechanism. If you guys want to learn more about ego defense mechanisms, then please do feel free to read up on those in your own time. Next, we have just a visual example of where the id, the ego, and the superego sit in the conscious and the unconscious. So the superego and the ego are both semi-conscious. We are aware of the demands of the real world and the demands of others and morality. We are not aware of the demands of our id, so our internal desire to be immediately gratified. We are also not fully aware of other parts of our personality, but they kind of interact with each other, and we are aware of some things in our we are aware of all things in our consciousness, and some of our superego and ego is in our consciousness. The final assumption of this approach is that adult behaviour and internal experiences are rooted in childhood experiences. And this is the psychosexual stages of development. Now, I referred to this in the previous slide. Freud believed that events in our childhood influence our adult lives and shape our personalities. Events that occur in childhood can remain in the unconscious and influence our adult feelings and behaviour. For example, if a child were to see a cat getting hit by a car, for example, that might deeply traumatise them, and that would stay in their unconscious, and that might end up manifesting in adult behaviour as being fearful of cars or being fearful of cats if you associate a cat with pain and accidents. So that is one of Freud's examples of how childhood behaviour can influence adult behaviour. Personality, however, is shaped during the psychosexual stages of development in childhood. So all of our childhood experiences can influence our adult behaviour, but our personalities are developed during these psychosexual stages. So here are the psychosexual stages. There are 5 stages: the oral stage, the anal stage, the phallic stage, the latency stage, and the genital stage. The oral stage is from the age of birth to around 1 year old, and at this point the child's focus of gaining pleasure is their mouth. Freud called this their libido focus, so the area of their body that they are associate with pleasure at that time. So libido focus at this stage is their mouth. If a child becomes fixated at this stage, for example, if there are issues with breastfeeding, or if the child isn't fully gratified in other oral areas at this stage, then they might develop an oral fixation. Now, this would affect their adult personality by perhaps giving them disordered eating behaviours, perhaps they smoke a lot. They would have issues with their behaviour that surround their mouths. So that would be why it is an oral fixation. At the anal stage of development, this occurs around the age of 1 to 2 when the child is learning to potty train. So at this point, the libido focus is the anus. Now, this is because children at this stage are realising that they can control what goes out of their body by manipulating their anus, so they can use the toilet or not, and they are suddenly understanding that they have control over one thing. So this becomes quite exciting to them. However, if there is a disruption in this stage, if they feel over or under gratified during this stage, they will develop an anal fixation. So they might develop OCD traits in adulthood. They might become incredibly clean, incredibly tidy. They might have other fixations or obsessions, or the opposite. They might be very, very messy. They might be incredibly disorganized. So at this point, if the child becomes fixated, they would have these anal fixation aspects of their adult personality. Next, we have the phallic stage. Now, the phallic stage occurs between the ages of 3 and 6, and at this point the child realises that they have genitals. It's the first time the child really understands what genitals are at a very basic level, and if the child gets fixated at this stage, if they do not go through the Oedipus and Electra complex, more on that in just a little while, then they will develop a sexual or moral dysfunction, according to Freud. So this would manifest in adult behaviour with homosexuality, immorality, inappropriate sexual behaviours, and conduct. Next, we have the latency stage. This occurs between the age of 6 and puberty, and there is no libido focus at this stage. Children start to play with same-sex peers. They become friendly with other children, but they have no sexual or libido focus at that time. There is no fixation at this stage. Finally, we have the genital stage. Now, this is after the child has gone through puberty, and at this point the libido focus moves back to their genitals. So they again gain pleasure through their genitals, and they start to engage in sexual contact with members of the opposite sex. At this point, if they gain a fixation, this is perfect because this is where they are mentally healthy. So fixation at the final stage, at the genital stage, results in mental health and no sexual immorality. Now, I understand that what I'm saying right now sounds very controversial and homophobic, and it is not because that is my personal opinion at all. This was Freud's theory of how people developed homosexual behaviours. Now, I'm just going to return to 2 steps of this psychosexual stages of development. The first is the anal stage. So at the anal stage, the ego develops. So if you remember, we had the id, the ego, and the superego. The id is present from birth, and the ego develops at the anal stage. However, the superego develops once the child has successfully gone through the phallic stage of development. This is because of something very different that occurs during this time. This is the Oedipus or Electra complex. So during the phallic stage, between the ages of 3 and 6, the child, according to Freud, will fall in love with their opposite sex parent. The child sees that their same-sex parent is in the way of their relationship with their opposite-sex parent, and therefore decides that they want to kill them. In particular, with girls, with little girls, the reason that they want to be with their father and therefore kill their mother is because they experience something called penis envy. So Freud believed that everybody wanted to have a penis, and girls go through the Electra complex because they want to gain their father's penis, but they see that their mother is in the way. So they want to kill their mother so that they can have a penis by having their father's penis. However, the child realises that this is unrealistic, as their same-sex parent has the advantage of being older and more powerful, and therefore they probably won't win in this fight to the death for their opposite-sex parent's affection. In particular, male children experience something called castration anxiety. Now, this is where they fear that their father is aware of their desire to be with their mother, and that once he realises this, he will cut off their penis. So, instead of killing their same-sex parent, the child instead identifies with their same-sex parent and takes on their moral compass. So this is where the superego develops. The child takes on the parent's superego, so that they instead will be able to grow up and find a partner of their own. So that boys will be able to find a woman like their mother, and girls will be able to find a partner and give birth to a son, and therefore they will have access to penises. Again, very strange theory, not one that I'm saying is particularly appropriate. So, as we can see in the psychosexual stages of development, the children go through these different stages. If they are fixated at any stage, then they may end up having these oral, anal, or phallic fixations, which have implications for adult behaviour and personality and psychopathology. But once they've developed their superego, they will kind of be able to carry on and become mentally healthy. Finally, we have the biological approach. The assumptions of the biological approach are that abnormality is a result of physiological abnormalities in the brain, or physiological abnormalities within the physical components of the human body. So these fall into 3 categories. The first is biochemical imbalance. The second is physical brain abnormalities. And the third is genetic or hereditary disposition. So, the first is biochemical imbalances. Now, this assumes that abnormality is the result of a chemical imbalance. So, the chemicals that are being referred to here are neurotransmitters, or hormones that act like neurotransmitters in some cases. Neurotransmitters are electrical messengers that transmit electrical impulses, so messages, around the brain via neurons, so pathways. So here we see a neuron, and neurotransmitters fire electrical impulses down the neuron, and then they will connect to another neuron at the end of here. So this is one neuron, but you have billions and billions in your heads, in your brain, and they all connect to each other via the these dendrites, they're called, at the end of the neuron. You don't need to know too much about that right now. Now, neurotransmitters can be either excitatory, which means they are more likely to send an electrical impulse down the neuron, or inhibitory, which means they are likely to reduce the electrical impulse going down the synapse. The biological approach assumes that imbalances of mood-stabilizing neurotransmitters can cause depression and other psychopathological issues. So, for example, serotonin is an inhibitory neurotransmitter. This neurotransmitter stabilizes our mood. It does this by ensuring that there is not too much overexcitement within the neurons in the brain. However, if there is not enough serotonin, then we might have too much excitatory activity in our brain. So this would mean that there is a chemical imbalance causing behavioural and pathological issues, such as depression. With addiction, we can see imbalances in the neurotransmitter dopamine as a result of taking psychoactive drugs or engaging in other addictive behaviours. The second assumption is that psychopathology is caused by physical brain abnormalities. So abnormality is caused by brain injury or by a brain growth issue. You see, different parts of the brain are associated with different functions. We have here our frontal lobe associated with inhibition and the more complex human aspects of the human condition. We have our temporal lobe, which is broadly associated with processing auditory information. Our parietal lobe is broadly associated with motor information, so movement, and our occipital lobe is again broadly associated with vision. Of course, the whole brain is far more complicated than that, but this is the very, very basics of localization of the brain. Damage to different parts of the brain can create abnormality, because if an individual is not able to fully function in that area, then that part of the brain is damaged. For example, here we see Phineas Gage. Now, he is one of the key case studies in the biological approach to support the concept of physical brain abnormalities causing psychopathology. Phineas Gage was a railway worker who was building railway tracks, and he attempted to push gunpowder into a rock in order to explode it with a metal rod. Now, as he was doing that, the metal rod must have sparked against the stone, causing the gunpowder to explode. And the metal rod, as you can see in the image here, fired straight through his skull. Now, this did not kill Phineas. It caused him great pain, and it was a miracle that it didn't kill him. However, he did manage to survive. But he had issues in his prefrontal cortex. So here, the frontal lobe, as I said before, is associated with inhibition, so sexual inhibition and control of our behaviour. Phineas Gage, after his accident, became very uninhibited, so his inhibition centres of his brain were damaged by the rod, meaning that his behaviour completely changed. He became aggressive and sexually inappropriate. According to his friends and family, he completely changed. Now, this shows how damage to some parts of our brain can result in psychopathology. Finally, we have genetic predisposition. So behavioural abnormality is the result of genetic abnormality. Charles Darwin published On the Origin of Species, and this described the process of natural selection, so how behaviours can be passed down from generation to generation and physiological physiological aspects of ourselves can be passed down from generation to generation. Genes are the genetic information carried by DNA in chromosomes, and they're found within a cell's nucleus. In line with Darwin's theory of evolution, it might follow that genes form a basis of our behaviour, and so behaviour and our physiological aspects of ourselves can both be heritable. Now, some very interesting studies have found a lot of support for this. An example of this is rates of depression. So, if we study monozygotic and dizygotic twins, so monozygotic being from the same zygote, identical twins, and dizygotic being from different zygotes, so fraternal or non-identical twins, then we could see how rates of depression are differ depending on how many genes you share with your sibling, with your twin. So, the concordance rate means what % of the time, if one twin has major depression, will the other twin have major depression. They found with monozygotic twins that 45% of the time, over 45% of the time, if one twin had major depression, then the other twin had major depression. Now, if dizygotic twins share only half of the DNA when compared to monozygotic twins, we can expect that if depression is the result of our genes, that we would see that that concordance rate is cut in half. So looking at the concordance rate, for male twins, we see that it is 14%. For female twins, we see that it is 22%. But then if we look at combined, it is 20%. So we can see there that as the rate of shared genes decreases, the rates of depression or the concordance rates of depression also decrease. So this is strong evidence for there being a genetic predisposition to depression. Now, that brings us to the end of Monday's session of Psychopathology 1. Now, here is your class discussion, which I hope that you will do in your own time. I would like you to watch the TED Talk in the link provided by Ruby Wax, a stand-up comedian and clinical psychologist, called What's So Funny About Mental Illness. And I'd like you to engage with the forum to respond to these questions. What is your response to this talk? Do you agree or disagree with what Ruby Wax is saying? How do you believe that modern life contributes to mental illness? And do you believe that stigma is a societal issue? The video is less than 10 minutes long. In class, if we were to be doing this in class, I would expect you to discuss this with your friends on your table for around 30 minutes. And so I'm expecting about 30 minutes of work to go into your forum discussion. This does not need to be scientifically written. It does not need to have references. I'm looking for your responses, your opinions, the exact same way that you would do this in class. Thank you very much for reading and for watching this presentation. I look forward to seeing your responses over the week.